let's take a look at our oceans unit and some vocabulary and important concepts. So our first term here is increase. So if you have a decrease in water temperature, then that is going to cause an increase in dissolved oxygen. The reason why that is because cold water can hold more dissolved oxygen. So the lower the temperature, the higher the amount of dissolved oxygen available. Photosynthetic plankton can't grow in the deep zone of the ocean. So the deep zone is at the very bottom of the ocean where it's pitch black. And photosynthetic plankton are going to require sunlight. And so the reason why photosynthetic plankton, phytoplankton can't grow in the deep zone is because they don't have access to sunlight. So you're not going to find those phytoplankton in the deep zone because of that. A bear eating a fish is an example of how aquatic and terrestrial food webs can be interconnected. So an aquatic food web is going to take place in the water, a terrestrial food web takes place on the land. And if you have an aquatic and a terrestrial food web interconnected, then that shows something from the water eating something from the land, or something from the land eating something from the water. The benthic zone is going to be at the very bottom of the ocean. So the deep zone is referred to sometimes as the benthic zone, and that's because you find benthos organisms at the bottom. And it's also going to have the highest amount of pressure because it has all the water above it pressing downward. So the deep zone, the benthic zone, is going to have the highest pressure. An estuary is going to be found where the river meets the sea. So it's going to be found where a body of fresh water runs into the ocean. So this river here is going to be carrying fresh water. Here's our ocean. The ocean is salt water. So the estuary is going to be this area where that water is mixing, and it's going to have brackish water. It's going to have water that is a lower salinity. So it's going to be a mix of fresh and salt water. Sonar is going to use sound waves in order to determine the depth of an area. So it's used to bounce sound waves from a ship to the bottom of the ocean. And if it takes a really long time for that sound wave to bounce off the ocean floor and return to the ship, then that means that that area is really deep. And if it is a quick sort of ping, then that means that it's going to be really shallow in that area. So sonar helps to measure the depth of the ocean floor. Crabs are an example of an organism that can burrow into the sand in the intertidal zone. So that would be like up at the beach. Chemosynthesis is a process that is going to be similar to photosynthesis. It's going to be the process that's the base of a food web at the bottom of the ocean in the benthic zone, particularly around hydrothermal vents, these black smokers. So these are at the very bottom of the ocean. And you're going to have chemosynthesis as a process that allows for bacteria produce energy as a result of consuming this methane, CH4, at the bottom of the ocean. Phytoplankton and aquatic plants are going to release oxygen as a product of photosynthesis. So this is just your standard equation for photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is going to use carbon dioxide and water in order to produce glucose and oxygen. The surface zone is going to be the only zone of the open ocean where there's enough sunlight that the growth of aquatic plants and algae will be supported. So the surface zone is going to be the only area where you've got that sunlight, and thereby you're going to also have algae and aquatic plants. The deep zone is going to have hydrothermal vents, and these habitats are going to have mineral deposits that build up these columns, and you're also going to have tube worms, crabs, mussels, bacteria around them. And so bacteria are going to make the base of the food chain in these deep zone habitats in the hydrothermal vent areas. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to be the two most abundant dissolved gases. So they're going to be the two most abundant gases that are found in ocean water. Upwelling occurs when wind pushes warm surface water out of the way, and as the wind blows that warm surface water, which is less dense, so that's why it's up at the surface, as that water is moved out of the way, then you have cold water that moves up to take its place, and as the cold water moves upward, it's going to bring nutrients along with it. So that's going to increase fish populations in these areas because you're going to have fish swimming upward to get all the nutrients and food that has been pushed upward as well. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic plankton, also referred to as algae sometimes, and these are going to make up the base of any marine food web. The photic zone is also another name for the surface zone. So the photic zone, photo means light, and so the photic zone is going to be the surface zone, and it's referred to as that because it has access to sunlight. Animals at the bottom of the ocean are going to be considered benthic animals, and that's also why the benthic zone is called the benthic zone, is because those animals that are considered benthos are going to be found there. The three zones of the ocean, in order starting at the beach, are the intertidal, the neritic, and the open ocean. So up at the beach, at the coastline, you're going to have the intertidal. As you go a little bit further out, it's going to be neritic, and the open ocean is where you have the drop-off of the continental shelf onto the continental slope and further out into the ocean. Seafloor spreading occurs at the mid-ocean ridge, and that's where new ocean floor is created. Bioluminescence. Bio means life, lumen means light. So bioluminescence is going to be the process where living organisms produce light. And so these organisms are primarily going to be found at the bottom of the ocean where it's pitch black. And so these organisms, not all organisms, but some animals do produce their own light. So they use a process that will allow for chemicals to generate this light, and it can be done for a variety of reasons, such as attracting prey or mate, or it could be used as a warning even. A mining technique that uses drag lines and buckets to obtain underwater mineral deposits is called dredging. So it basically just scoops along the bottom of the ocean. The intertidal zone is going to be up at the beach, and you're going to have a lot of different habitats that can be found in the intertidal zone. And so that's going to include estuaries, mangrove forests, salt marshes, tide pools. So all those are different types of habitats, but they're habitats that can be found in the intertidal zone. Mangrove forests are going to be areas where you have lots of mangrove trees. And again, so it's an intertidal habitat. And it's made of these mangrove trees that are going to extend above the water, but also they have really gnarly, thick roots, and they help to stabilize coastlines from erosion. And so they're going to be these really thick roots. They extend down into the ground, and they also provide a nursery for small animals because it's a very protective area because of all those thick masses of roots. Coral reefs are they're built of calcite skeletons, so they are made of basically the bodies of coral animals, and the coral animals secrete this calcite material, and it all over time will basically solidify, and the coral reefs are primarily going to be found in warm, shallow, tropical water, but there are coral reefs that grow at the bottom of the ocean in cold water as well, but those are going to be cold water corals, and most of the curriculum for us in 8th grade focuses on the warm water corals. Ocean currents regulate air temperature all over the world by circulating the heat in the oceans. So if you have a really warm area, then that means that the water that's nearby is going to be warmer as well. So the Gulf of Mexico, for example, is going to be really warm water. So the air above that is going to have a lot of moisture, and it's going to be really warm. Whereas up at the northern part of the United States is colder, and so you're going to have colder water and colder air as well. Ocean currents are going to affect climate. So as you have the ocean water circulating, the warmer water is going to be carrying that warmer air above it, whereas colder water is going to have colder air above it. Petroleum is oil. So dredging, mining, drilling all have to do with bringing this oil this petroleum into the environment. And when that happens, it can damage ecosystems. Ocean acidification is going to occur when carbon dioxide mixes with ocean water, and when carbon dioxide and water mix together, it forms carbonic acid, and that can eat away at things like limestone and corals. So this prevents the formation of carbonate ions in the water, and that means that animals that rely on those carbonate ions in order to build their shells, like shellfish and the seashells here, clams, oysters, things like that, they're not going to be able to build their shells. And so ocean acidification is going to mean that the shells of those organisms that require shells as their habitat and their shelter are not going to have shells, or they're going to have very flimsy, thin, brittle shells. El Nino is going to reduce upwelling, and that causes a reduction in fish populations near the surface. And that can negatively impact fishermen because they're not going to be able to catch as much fish, and that means they're going to make less money. So it can definitely negatively impact their economics and their lifestyle. A trench is going to form when an ocean plate sinks below a continental plate at a subduction zone. So as you have two plates that are moving together and one subducts, one moves under the other, then that's going to cause a trench to form. A lot of wildlife can be found in an estuary because it can serve as a nursery for baby animals. So there's going to be lots of good hiding places and lots of areas like those roots and mangrove forests that can be good for protection. An increase in salinity of an estuary is going to cause the number of salt-tolerant organisms to increase. So if you have saltier water, that means animals that can tolerate a lot of salinity, a lot of salt water, are going to be able to thrive in those areas. The term tolerant just refers to an organism that can exist in the presence of something like salt or pollution. So if it's a pollution-tolerant organism, then it can live in areas where it's polluted. If it's salt-tolerant, that means it can live in areas that have a lot of salt. If it's salt-intolerant, then it's not going to be able to tolerate a lot of salt. It's going to prefer fresh water or really low salinity. So if it's intolerant, describes an organism that cannot exist. It can't live in the presence of something like salt or pollution. An ROV is going to be a remotely operated vehicle, and it's an underwater robot that's used to explore the ocean floor and to collect samples of different specimens or water samples even. Upwellings are going to be beneficial to fishermen because upwelling events are going to bring more fish to the surface, and that means the fishermen can catch more fish and they can have more fish not only to eat but to sell, and so that helps them economically as well. Brackish water is going to be a mixture of fresh and salt water, and so brackish water is going to be found in an estuary. Algae, phytoplankton, they're going to be photosynthetic, and they're going to be producers. So they're going to be the base of any marine, or of most marine food webs. They're not going to be the base of the hydrothermal vent deep zone food webs, but the majority of the food webs that take place in the ocean are going to have algae and photosynthetic phytoplankton as their base. The Environmental Protection Agency is the EPA, and it's responsible for protecting our nation's drinking water. The Benthic Zone is going to have a lot of high pressure, whereas up towards the surface of the ocean, the surface zone is going to have much lower pressure. Of the different resources that can be found in the ocean, oil provides the greatest economic benefit. And anytime you see the word economic or you hear economic, that's referring to money. The production of light by living organisms is called bioluminescence, and usually bioluminescence is going to be used to help an organism to lure in its prey, kind of like on Finding Nemo when you have the anglerfish with the little light, and Dory thinks the light is really pretty and is swimming up to it. So that's luring in another fish. Oceans affect climate by regulating the temperatures as water is circulated around the ocean. So it's anytime you have colder water currents, it's going to make the air above it colder. If you have warmer currents of water, then you're going to have warmer air above it. Seafloor spreading is going to occur at the mid-ocean ridge, and it's the process where new seafloor is formed. And dredging is going to be mining. It's going to be pulling up resources from the bottom of the ocean, and it can have a negative impact on environments, and it's got the most potential to negatively impact ecosystems. So dredging, mining, drilling, those are going to negatively impact ecosystems as they're obtaining those natural resources.